So it's a pleasure to be speaking with the group in Montreal and to have our colleagues connected in La Plata and at Graz. A special thank you to Kai Seidenberg, who initially proposed this session. And thanks to Alinka for providing an excellent overview, and I look forward to seeing the details of that large survey as they unfold over the coming years. So my take is going to be a little different. It's going to be a little more experimentally driven, but I'll start with a high-level overview. So as has been said, hearing loss affects many aspects of audition. However, compared to speech perception, there are fewer standardized tests available that allow us to test people's ability to hear the details of music. And our intent with developing the AMP, or the Adaptive Music Perception test, was really to have an instrument that would allow us to assess the efficacy of a hearing aid. So potentially, hearing aid manufacturers, even audiologists, could administer a test like this, make some tweaks to the signal processing or to the fitting, administer the test again in order to have a more objective means of determining whether there has been some improvement. This approach does not replace the subjective question. I see it as complementary. So it's always useful to ask the customer or the client, whatever the context is, how does this sound? But I think these objective tests are helpful, and I hope you'll be convinced of that by the end of my talk. So I did have this slide prepared about what the users say, but I think Alinka Griesley's talk provides much more context. But just to recap from an older survey that was done by Moore's group in 2014, some of the most frequent complaints about music among hearing aid users is that music is too loud, music is less clear, sometimes it's distorted, it's lacking in bass, and that's actually counters to some of the survey results I think I understood from Alinka's presentation. This very well could have something to do with the advent of music programs in hearing aids. It also worsens tone quality. In any case, over the last decade, manufacturers have increasingly rolled out these music programs, and they feature prominently in their marketing. So you'll see manufacturers actually leading, not with the problem that brings people into the audiology office, but rather an elegant couple arriving at the opera, for example, not someone struggling to understand someone in a noisy party situation, which is ultimately what tends to bring people to the doctor's office. So there's an appreciation that this is a problem, but I think we really have a great opportunity to improve things because we continue to have a large number of complaints about how the music sounds. This is particularly the case for people that were real music lovers before they started to lose their hearing. They complain and have, I think, a very concrete understanding of how things have changed. So what outcomes are relevant? As I said, it's useful to simply ask the listener about sound quality. How does this sound? And we can have a more fine-grained approach, as I've done in some of my past work, other people have done. We could ask about brightness. We could ask about pleasantness. We could slice up the pie of sound quality, but ultimately that's just one approach. The other approach, I think, is music intelligibility, and I see this as a complement to speech intelligibility. So the way that we're approaching this is to take different dimensions of music and to assess them from a psychoacoustic perspective, but to do this within a musical context. If we simply administered psychoacoustic tests, like frequency difference Lyman's, for example, this will give us some insight as to how people are hearing in hearing aids, but I don't know that it's going to generalize to the way people listen to music. So our approach has been to give people musically relevant tasks, but to embed within them adaptive threshold testing. So at the end of the day, what we arrive at are thresholds for different low-level parameters that we can ultimately reach from an engineering perspective. So we can ultimately manipulate compression, for example, temporal windows, different aspects of the gain function in order to maximize these outcomes. You know, it's really challenging because we're working from abstract problems. This does not sound good, it's distorted, it doesn't sound like I remember. And then we're dealing with what's the time window, what's the level of compression on the engineering side. So we're trying to meet this from both sides through this approach. And we see that as music intelligibility. Having said that, there's been plenty of work on, plenty of laboratory work where people have manipulated compression and other parameters, and they've asked people about sound quality. We've done some of that work ourselves. This is a review paper that outlines a number of the findings, and the print is very small, but what I'll say is that the consensus view here is that less compression is more. So compression is a standard signal processing procedure that needs to happen in hearing aids. The issue is that we're amplifying sound so that it's audible to people who have some signal level problems. But in doing so, we get very, very loud levels, dangerously loud levels, also levels that are going to cause distortion in the device. So we need to compress the signal while amplifying everything. What this does, however, is that it really, in my view, in my layman's terms, it sucks the life out of the music. It is stealing some of the dynamic range that gives the music pop, that gives the music groove, that allows you to feel the pulse in the music. And people do complain about that. All right, so music intelligibility. I've already kind of foreshadowed this, so I think this slide is a little redundant. Again, our alternative is to embed adaptive threshold testing in a quasi-ecological musical listening task. And we have the amp for that. Okay, so what we've done is we've arbitrarily broken down music into 4 components. These are conventional components. It could have been done a little differently: meter, harmony, melody, and timbre. We drill down further into specific psychoacoustic measurements. And those include things like level, pitch, duration, dissonance, melody to chord ratio, and then different timbral parameters, and I'll explain those in greater detail in just a little bit. The initial test was explained in great detail in this paper by Martin Kirkberger. Martin is really he's a former PhD student, and he's really the engine that drove the AMP test and started us on the road to collecting data from listeners with the AMP test and validating the test. So what I'm going to do is provide you with an overview of the test. You'll hear from some sound examples, and then I'm going to present you with the data we've collected thus far from normal hearing listeners, hearing impaired listeners, as well as hearing aided listeners, both when they're using their hearing aids and when we remove the hearing aids. We feel that all of those conditions provide a unique and important window to understand the problem well. This is the first subtest of the AMP. It's the meter test. In the meter test, you're presented with a sequence of tones, and the sequence of tones is accented in some manner. We accent through level, pitch, or duration. And in doing so, we can set up a duple meter or a triple meter. And the participant's task is a forced choice task. They have to say whether it's in 2 or in 3, and the answer is right or wrong. And through a staircase procedure, we can reduce the level, we can reduce the pitch, we can reduce the duration until we get the threshold at which they can accurately hear the meter. Does that make sense to people? Okay, so let's listen to an example. Okay, so of course that's in 2. And it's accented by pitch. And it was quite an easy accent. So we can reduce that pitch difference so that it's microtonal, and we arrive at your threshold. And from trial to trial, we'll pop around, we'll manipulate level, we'll manipulate pitch, we'll manipulate duration. You don't know what we're manipulating. All that you know is your task is to say it's in 2 or in 3. Because again, we want to keep this ecologically valid as a music listening task. Okay, then we have the harmony subtest. In the harmony subtest, we have a 4-5-1 cadence, so a classical cadence. And what we have in each case is the chord. It's a bichord. And what we're manipulating is the tuning of the one chord. And what we're doing is we're creating dissonance in the one chord by manipulating the pitch interval between the two tones, or we're actually doing a transposition where we're moving the entire stack up or down. But keep in mind, this is not a transposition by step or anything like that. These are on the order of 10 cents, 20 cents, because we're trying to arrive at a threshold. So we'll listen to an example. Your task is to say which of those two cadences was less resolved. Of course, the first is less resolved, and the manner in which it was less resolved is through what we're going to call dissonance. Okay? But again, we could have had an intonation change by just moving the one chord up or down by a few cents. The next subtest is the melody subtest. This, now I should say that we've assessed the role of music training in these tests, and ideally it would be absent. It's not absent. There is an effect of music training across these subtests. We do not see it as problematic because of the way in which these tests are going to be administered. We're not interested really in group tests between musicians and non-musicians. We're interested in testing between signal processing algorithms or between fittings that the audiologist might do. So your hearing is functionally going to be different, but your music training is not going to be different. Does that make sense to people? Music training doesn't change, so although music training has an effect on your ability to do these tasks, that is not a problem here. Having said that, this test is freely available. I'll provide the link later. If you do choose to use this test, I do not advise using this particular subtest with non-musicians. And the reason is that they tend to find it very frustrating. It's sort of like a signal-to-noise test. We call it a melody-to-chord test. And what we're doing is we're presenting a chord. The chord is sustained. We play a melody that's within the same key over that chord. Then we do it again, and your task is to say whether the two melodies are same or different. Okay? And the comparison melody, I should say, is always presented in transposition. The timbre subtest. So the timbre subtest is maybe the closest to a traditional psychoacoustic test of any of the subtests, but we still see it as musically relevant. What we're getting people to do is an ABX test. So we present the A tone, the B tone, and then the X tone, the final tone, and what you're to do is to say whether the final X tone is like the A or the B. Okay, what's it more similar to? And what we do from trial to trial is we manipulate the brightness, the attack, or the spectral irregularity of the tones. So that, again, we can arrive at a threshold for each of these. Here's an example. You're going to hear one ABX sequence, and your task will be to say whether it sounds like the first or second tone. So what we were manipulating there is spectral irregularity, and the X tone was like the B tone. That would have been the correct answer. Okay, so I can now get into some data, and I'm going to go quickly. We have 19 normal hearing participants, no hearing loss, less than 20 dBHL, 21 hearing impaired participants. These folks don't wear hearing aids, but they have hearing impairments. Then we have 31 hearing impaired participants. These are people who've been to the audiologist, they own hearing aids, they wear hearing aids. But we test them in two conditions. We test them when they're wearing the hearing aid, and we test them when we remove the hearing Here is the first result. What you're looking at is normal hearing versus hearing impaired people. So these hearing impaired people are not wearing hearing aids. And what you see is the threshold for the meter frequency test is better for the normal hearing participants. In each case, what you're going to be seeing on these slides is box plots. Whenever the bars are highlighted in blue, we have a significant difference. Now you're looking at the harmony subtest. Again, the normal hearing people are having an easier time hearing the intonation changes than the hearing impaired people. In the timbre subtests, two of the parameters, brightness and spectral irregularity, were easier for the normal hearing than the hearing impaired participants. Now we get into sort of the purpose of the test, looking at people with aids. But in this first instance, what I'm comparing is people that are, nobody is wearing a hearing aid here. All we're comparing is people who are hearing impaired, who don't normally wear a hearing aid, to people who are hearing aided, who are currently not wearing their aids because we asked them to remove them. Okay? And what you can see is that the hearing impaired people are doing worse than the hearing aided people without their aids. Okay, so we can, there's some conjecture here, but it's possible that people that have untreated hearing loss, there's some atrophy in central processes that are allowing them to process these low-level parameters that in turn influence their ability to hear higher-level parameters in music. Now, hearing aided, unaided versus aided. Same people, we remove the hearing aid or they wear the hearing aid. And I think this is where some of the surprise is, and some of the most surprising results are. Here we are finding a few instances where not wearing your hearing aid is better than wearing your hearing aid. Okay? So in the case of level discriminations, removing your hearing aids is actually better. I should say, in reference to Olympus talk, this is all recorded music. The situation would likely be different for live music. When we look at timbre discriminations, and specifically the attack time, again, people without aids are doing better than people with aids. So I'll point out that both of the conditions in which people without aids are outperforming people with aids are conditions that affect the level of the signal. One of the main things that happens in a hearing aid, once again, is that there is compression, okay, that affects these level differences. I think that is the source of what's going on here. And as I said, the consensus view is that relaxing compression in hearing aids is a good thing for music. Now what we're doing, I'll try to wrap up with just some correlations. What we're looking at is the consistency of results, or rather, to what extent is the effect of hearing aid consistent across participants. And the way we're assessing this is by looking at the thresholds for unaided and aided. These are the same people, but we're correlating their thresholds. So of course, the thresholds will vary as a function of whether they're wearing the aids or not. But if we have a linear correlation, which we do here because it's highlighted in blue, then this means that the effect of the hearing aid on level is relatively consistent across participants. That's the way we're interpreting this. The same is true of the frequency discriminations and the duration discriminations. So it's not that some hearing aids were doing this better than others or something like that. And it's important to say that we had no control over these hearing aids. These are folks that came in from our database. They're sort of from the wild. We catch them through advertisements. We bring them in. We test their audiometry. We ask them a few questions, but we do not manipulate their hearing. And the same is true of all the timbre dimensions. So the hearing aids are consistently doing damage or helping, whatever the case may be. In the case of harmony, we have differences, and I think that's interesting. So harmony is not being treated consistently across the hearing aids. Maybe this is because some manufacturers are doing things a little differently than others. I'm sure it's because some of these hearing aids had frequency lowering schemes, others did not. That's all I will say about that. The final point is that we searched as hard as we could for ways to predict which people are going to benefit from using their aids when listening to recorded music. And it's a really hard problem. It's a hard problem in speech, too. We were not able to predict the benefit of hearing aids from the pure tone audiometry. But when we look just at high-frequency pure tone audiometry, okay, so not 500, 1,000, but looking at 2,000 and beyond, and we're looking at that higher frequency threshold, then those people who have greater losses are benefiting more from wearing their hearing aids. Okay, so that's, again, some complementary information that could be useful. Conclusions. The findings of this study add to our knowledge of how hearing loss and hearing aids affect music perception. Specific conclusions that can be drawn from this work are as follows. Users of hearing aids report difficulties with music perception. Okay? Lots of evidence for this. In addition to judgments of sound quality, optimization may benefit from ecologically valid measures of music intelligibility. Okay, this is a nice compliment to just asking people how it sounds. The AMP uses an adaptive staircase procedure in the context of music listening tasks. Hearing impaired listeners have lower musical intelligibility than normal hearing listeners in some of these subtests. Hearing aids make matters worse for level and attack dimensions. The benefits of hearing aids are greater for listeners with worse high-frequency sensitivity. You can download the AMP test and documentation you can just go to smartlaboratory.org and find your way, or you can copy down that link. I'd like to thank these collaborators and these sponsors. Thank you.
If not, we can go to Graz.
Thank you, Frank. That was a really inspiring talk. Are there any questions in Montreal?
No, I don't. Oh, yes,
there's a hand up.
One moment.
Thanks, Frank. Have you looked at all at how performance on the AMP then correlates with other measures of speech intelligibility, just to sort of get the two working together?
No, that's a nice question. Maybe we should think about doing that. We haven't. One of the things we've done a little bit of work on is looking to what extent does scores on the AMP relate to the subjective ratings. And they are related, but they're not perfectly related. You know, I think there's a lot of wiggle room when you ask people questions about how things are doing. There's just optimistic people and pessimistic people. So those two things are not perfectly correlated.
Other questions in Montreal?
Yeah, cool stuff, Frank. So I listened to some $1,800 pair of headphones yesterday, and they're amazing. So I'm kind of curious if you're going from live music to some highly compressed MP3 style, that's kind of the thing. And so two questions. You kind of alluded to this at the beginning, can you like tune the signal processing characteristics to improve it? And there's a lot of variability in the types of hearing aids that your subjects had, and maybe the super fancy ones might show less degradation of some of these things.
Yeah, I think it's certainly possible that some of the super fancy hearing aids are doing a better job than others. But I will say that most digital hearing aids today have a music program. And it seems to me that if you've received your hearing aid within the last 3 years, then there's a very strong likelihood that your hearing aid is going to have a scene detection algorithm. So while it's doing its thing, there are multiple pipelines. If you look at the flow chart of the way that the signal is processed in a hearing aid, it's really impressive. So there are these very long temporal envelopes where data is being accumulated, and then that gets fed into some machine learning solution for, oh yeah, that's a cafe with music in the background. I have to prioritize speech over the music. Oh, this is a live music venue. And I think some of the manufacturers are moving even further towards this is classical music. We would like less compression there than pop music, for example, where it may not matter how much compression that we apply. Having said that last thing, we've done some work where we actually manipulate the hearing aids, and we thought that applying compression differently across different genres would have different effects, and we just found that across genres, less compression was better. But yes, I think there's a role for, that's definitely one of the ways forward, to continue to have many, many automatic detection programs that identify where you are and do the fine tuning for those particular environments. There's always challenges with that too, because often, you know, the algorithm gets it wrong, and you have then, you know, you have to have my mother, whoever, like 75, 80-year-old person toggling, figuring out. So there's some folks that are ready to do that, and some folks that have a pretty hard time doing that.
All right, thank you so much. We've hit the 3-minute mark for transition. Thank you for your talk.
Thanks, Frank.